we're meeting with our covenant God when we come into the house of worship. Anytime God interacts with his creatures, that's a covenant relationship. And the fact that we meet with God as believers means that we have the relationship with him. And in the Bible, that term for relationship is covenant. And we see God enter into a covenant at the very beginning with Adam and Eve, and there's stipulations for how they are to obey him, how they're to worship and honor him, and they fail. And that could be the end of the story right there. But the wonderful thing is that it isn't the end of the story, that God comes back to them in grace and in mercy and condescension. And at that point in the garden, some things change in worship. Pre-fall, worship consisted of God's call or his command, the creation, Adam and Eve specifically responding in faith and obedience, and then that culminating in a feast, which is image for us, which is hinted for us with the tree of life. But because they failed, they're barred from that tree of life for a time being, at least. And now that we are sinners, the pattern of worship changes. There's other elements that are added. The first element is cleansing. Before sin entered the picture, that was unnecessary, but now we are unable to answer God's initial call. We're unrighteous, we're unclean, we're impure. We lack the holiness that we need to stand before the presence of God. And so we cue the sacrifices, right? Before the fall, worship was a bloodless affair. Ever since, though, God's covenant dealings require bloodshed as a sign of atonement, as a symbol that the price for sin has been paid. And so there's this cleansing aspect that's added to the call and the response and the meal. There's also now a commissioning aspect or ascending aspect in worship, that the meal isn't the complete consummation any longer. It's just a foretaste of a future consummation. And so we see this pattern play out in Scripture of God returning to his people, calling them, cleansing them, consecrating them by his word, feasting with them. Exodus is a perfect example of this, where God calls his people out of Egypt. He cleanses his people. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That is a cleansing language. It's redemptive historical language. It's about how he has redeemed them. Then he consecrates them or sets them apart with his word. This is the covenantal structure we're seeing of how God interacts with his people. He gives them the 10 Commandments, right? And after the 10 Commandments, what do we find? There's a feast. Exodus 24, one of my favorite passages in Scripture, right? Where the elders, Moses, they go up to the top of the mountain and they feast with God. But of course, they sin again. There's the golden calf episode, and we could think, okay, now this is going to be the end. But no, it's not. He comes again, returns again and again and again to his people. So the idea of the covenant in terms of worship is we're reminded every time when we come into God's house to worship of our obligation to him as being bound to him by covenant, how we have failed those obligations, and yet how God's grace and mercy far overcomes our failures, and how he continually returns to us because of our covenant redeemer, Jesus Christ. In Hebrews 12, it talks about how he's the mediator of a new covenant. And so we get in the New Testament this language of covenant. So we shouldn't think that covenant dealings pass away with the Old Testament, right? Hebrews tells us things have changed, but the covenant structure is still there. God's still dealing with us in terms of a covenant, but now that covenant is founded upon, fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And so I think as we come to worship, that should just enhance and magnify our love for Jesus Christ, who has made our meeting with God a possibility. But it's really important to understand that covenantal structure that's taking place. Our covenant king has called us. We're to respond in faith and obedience according to the word that he's consecrated us with. We fail, and yet he says he forgives us. He comes to us in Jesus Christ, and he gives us a meal to remind us that we are one with him. And then he sends us off into the world and says, now go be my emissaries, be my ambassadors, live lives of holiness, of righteousness, of truth. Come back next week and we do the whole thing all over again because we failed in that commission, right, Glenn? I mean, we go out and we have failed again to obey our covenant king, and yet he continues to come back and renew his faithfulness to us. And it's not as though, I say in the book, it's not as though he's renewing it like he's got a battery that's dying and he needs to recharge it. Like he's about to not be faithful to us and he needs to recharge his faithfulness. He's renewing it in the sense of proving to us again and again who he is and how faithful he is. The covenant renewal is for our benefit. That's what we get in worship. We're reminded of the covenant faithfulness of our God.